We learned a lot about some of the most important features of React, also about its core pillars and how you style React apps. Now, when you're building apps with React, or in general, if you're working as a developer, you will encounter errors. That will always happen. You'll never write code that is error-free. During your development process, you will always face errors. And in this module, you will learn how to debug React apps. So how you can find and fix errors. Because that's one of the most important things you need to be able to do as a developer. It's often overlooked, and I see way too many developers or also students in my courses that simply ask immediately that they get an error. They immediately look for others to help them. And that's the wrong approach. You need to be able to find and solve errors on your own, because errors will always be a part of development. Therefore, in this module, we will explore how you can make sense of the error messages React throws at you in certain circumstances. We will learn how we can debug and analyze React apps in general, how we can understand our code whilst it's executing. And we'll explore the React DevTools, an extra extension we can install in the browser to get a better React developer experience. Let's start with error messages. Attached, you find a project, this project here, which is a slightly altered version of the project we worked on over the last modules. Now, in this attached project, I added a couple of errors, a couple of problems. And therefore, if you run npm install and thereafter npm start, you will immediately get an error here in your terminal. If you visit the application in the browser, you will also basically get the same error output there instead of the application. And that is a common thing. Sometimes when you're writing code, you get errors. Errors which React catches, or the React development process catches and throws at you. And as I mentioned before, often in the Q&A section of my courses, for example, I see students who immediately panic when they see an error message and they don't read it themselves, they don't try to solve it themselves. Instead, they immediately create a new thread and ask for help. This will not help you as a developer. This will not make you a better developer. It will actually make you a worse developer. You need to be able to understand and solve errors on your own. So let's, for example, have a look at this error message. It failed to compile, and that's why we can't see the application. And the problem we have is that we have a parsing error. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a JSX fragment? Okay, we haven't heard about JSX fragments yet. This is something I'll cover later in the course. But we also have that first part, and we can make sense of that. Adjacent, which means side by side, JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And we also get a hint at the file and the line of code this error is stemming from. We even see the code snippet here below the message. We see that it comes from app.js, and there, line 43, column 7. That column part is not that important, but line 43. And if I go to my app.js file, we see here, line 43, even my IDE detects this error. Now, as a side note, this is an error my IDE is able to detect. It won't detect all React errors though. So sometimes you get an error which is not showing up in your IDE. But here I get an error which is shown in the IDE, which is also shown in this snippet, which is pointed at by this line of code here, and which I also see here in the browser. It also shows me that snippet, that file name, and that line information. I get all of that here as well. So what is wrong here? Well, there seems to be a rule in React that forces us to basically wrap neighboring side-by-side elements in one surrounding element. And here the problem is that we have a section next to a section, and such adjacent JSX element which you return are not allowed. Instead, you need to wrap them in one root element. Now in there you can have side-by-side elements, but whenever you return JSX or you store JSX in a variable, you must only have one root element in there, which then can wrap adjacent elements. That is a hard rule you have in React, and as a side note, and I will dive in that in more detail later, but as a side note, we have that rule because behind the scenes, this is this React create element code I showed you earlier, and you can't have two statements side by side being returned by one return statement either, for example. And that is what two adjacent sections would be translated to. And that's the reason, but we'll have a look at that in more detail later. But this is an error we are able to fix even without fully understanding where it's coming from, because the error message clearly tells us that we need an enclosing, so a wrapping, tag. And as soon as I do add such a tag, for example a div, I'm able to save this, and it now compiled successfully, and my app is back up and running. So that is an example of a React error message which we just had to read, and we were able to solve it. Now, other common mistakes that are often made are, for example, incorrect names of functions you're pointing at. Let's say here we're pointing at the addGoals handler function when it's actually named addGoalHandler. A simple typo. Again, my IDE detects it, it gives me a clear indicator that something's wrong here, and therefore we should check this and check it for typos, for example. But if I would save it nonetheless, again we get a compilation error also here, and we see that addGoalsHandler is not defined. Again, this is a pretty clear error message. We clearly are trying to use something, some variable, which isn't found by React. And then again, you should go to that place and check why it's not found. Maybe you have a typo. Maybe you forgot to define such a function or variable altogether. So here it's a typo. If you fix it, it compiles again. So don't panic, read error messages, have a look at the line and the file it's coming from, have a look at the code snippet it might be showing you, and then look at the problematic code part, at the problematic code snippet, look at the error message, connect the error message to the snippet it's pointing at, and you will be able to solve most errors. So with that error solved, the application is running again. Now I can start adding goals again. For example, master React, and also let's say check out our courses on React. Now I added these goals, and now I actually also have another error in this application. Another error which won't lead to a compilation error here and which won't show up here on the main screen though. If I delete my newly added check out our courses on React goal, you see it's there. Actually, the other goal I added was deleted, even though I clearly clicked on the check out our courses on React goal. So, since that worked before in the other course modules, there has to be something in my code that is causing this error. So what could be the problem here? I'm not getting an error message here on the screen, not here in the terminal either. So how can we now solve such an error? Well, there are a couple of things you can do, a couple of steps that are worth a try. Let's first of all go to the place where we have that deletion logic. We got our course goal list, and there we have on delete where we trigger props on delete item. If we go into a course goal item, we see on delete is in the end triggered when we click on that. I don't really see an error here. We are forwarding that ID. In course goal list, we just pass on that event in the end to on delete item on the course goal list component. So if we go to the app component, where this ultimately is being rendered, we see that the delete item handler is executed. And there we get the goal ID and we delete a goal. Now a goal was deleted, as we saw, just the wrong one, so the deletion logic in general seems to work, but maybe the ID is wrong. So maybe we should go to the place where the IDs are generated and assigned. And that's here in the add goal handler. And here indeed I changed something. I set my ID to a hard-coded string. Previously here I used math random to derive a pseudo-unique ID. Now with the hard-coded string, I introduced a logical error here. The error is that I assign the same ID to all goals. So therefore, they're no longer distinguishable by ID, and hence if we click on a goal, the first goal that has the ID, which is found in the goals array, is deleted. And that's always the first goal I ever added. That's why not this goal was deleted, but the goal which I added before. So that's a logical mistake. And I was able to narrow it down by going through that complete chain of events. We click on a goal, we trigger the deletion handler, and I had a look at all those steps to narrow down the problem to finally find this problem here. And this is a perfectly fine way of trying to solve this. Now here's another thing that could help you. If I add goals again, check out other courses on React and master React. If I do that, and I again click on the first goal and the second one is deleted, let's now open up the developer tools here. And there, let's have a look at the console, the JavaScript development and debugging console. Here, the browser gives us any logging messages we added to our code and also some warnings and errors that are thrown by the library, which don't crash the whole application necessarily. And here we see that we got a warning actually. And we get that warning already when we add a goal. The warning that I get here is in the end that React encountered two children with the same key. So two children with the same key were found here, with the key goal 1. And this is implicitly related to our deletion problem. Now again, we're not getting that warning when I delete something, we already get that warning when I add a new goal. But this already tells us that we have some error in our code, because if we got two children with the same ID, with the same key in the end, then we seem to have an error in our code where we assign the same ID multiple times, which indeed is the problem we have. And React, of course, also tells you where that problem occurs. This here is an error related to our list, because that key concept, as you learned in the lists and conditional module, is related to lists. But it is related to the list here in that unordered list in the course goal list component, line 8. So again, you get a pretty clear idea of where this warning in this case is coming from, and you can then have a look at the code there and find out why that problem occurs. And if you then work your way back to the place where goals are added, which is the place where the IDs are added, which in turn are the things that are used as keys here, we do use the goal ID as a key, well, then you would be able to come back to that place where the hard-coded goal 1 ID is. Because we even see that goal 1 is the problem here in the warning. So that's another way how you might have solved this problem. But you can also use another approach. You can use the debugger built into the browser. You can use breakpoints. So we have a pretty much logical error here in our code. We have the problem that we have the hard-coded ID, and we already learned how we can find and fix this error. Now let's say we didn't use any of the other two approaches, we overlooked that warning, and we don't know why it's behaving incorrectly. In such cases, if you can't find the error otherwise, or if you just prefer this approach maybe, you can go to the Sources tab here in the browser developer tools. And there you find in the end the source files that are being used on this web page right now. And that includes your JavaScript code. And the cool thing is that this React development process this npm start script here, which runs in the end, is set up such that it, of course, pushes code to the browser that is executable by the browser, but it also gives the browser extra information which the browser developer tools are able to pick up to allow us to actually debug our code in the raw form we wrote it in. So that we are able to debug with that code we're writing in these files, even though that technically isn't the code that's executed by the browser. So this React development process gives the browser a bridge between the code that runs in the browser and the code we wrote. And we can access this code here in the Sources tab by going to that users folder, which you should see. Users, your username, and then a source folder, and in there you find your React files, the files we actually also have here in our IDE. Now, if you don't find it here, you can also check out that Webpack folder, and there you might also find a source folder with your source files. You can look around because sometimes it's located in a different node, in a different subfolder, but somewhere here in the Sources tab, in this tree of files and folders, you should find your original source code. And then you could always dive into the different parts that you want to analyze. You could go into the course goal item, and there, for example, the delete handler, and simply add a breakpoint by clicking onto the line number where you want to add it. In this case, that delete handler function, which is triggered when we click on a list item, because that's where the deletion process starts. So maybe that is where we want to pause the code and then step through the code step by step so that we can find the problem. Once you add such a breakpoint, if you then execute that action that triggers that code part where the breakpoint is placed, code execution stops once it reaches that breakpoint line. So you see that here it's paused in the debugger, and that line is now highlighted in blue here, and you got surrounding information in those boxes at the bottom. For example, you see variables which are currently available, you see the call stack, and so on. And now you can do something cool. You can step through your code step by step. And for example, here we call the onDelete method on the props object, for example. So to have a look at what's going on there, we can use this step into next function call button. If we click that, we're in the delete item handler, which is the function that was triggered because of that props concept. And here we see that set course goals function which is being called. And you can also hover over variables here to see the values that are currently stored in them. And for example, if I hover over goal ID here, I see that it is goal 1. Now, this might or might not help me here, but I can see that I have goal 1 here when I clicked on this goal, which was actually the second goal I added. Now we can use the step over next function call button here to finish that set course goals function call. So now with that, the delete item handler basically finished. And the information we got is that we had the goal ID goal 1 for the goal we deleted, which, as we of course know, is the wrong goal to delete. So now we could resume script execution, because we're done with this debugging cycle, and simply try this again and click on the next goal. And dive into the next function call here. And see that here we have the same goal ID as before. So now this should be a point where we see, wait a second, if we have the same ID on two different goals on which I clicked here, that seems to be the problem why the wrong goal was deleted. So that's maybe the point where we resume script execution and then dive back into the code where we actually add goals, because that is where we set our IDs. And just by looking at that code, we of course should be able to see why we have goal 1 for every goal. So that's how we can use the breakpoints to step through our code step by step and even inspect values which are stored in variables and so on to find out why something behaves the way it does behave. So breakpoints, and you can always clear them by clicking on them again, breakpoints are another useful tool for analyzing your code, for understanding it, and for finding and fixing errors like that. And with that, I'll revert this to moth random to string, which of course then is an ID we can use without getting that warning. Now if I try this again, you see I don't get that warning. If I now add multiple goals, you see if I click on the first goal, I delete the first goal. So this now works, and that's another important set of tools. The debugging tools you got natively in your browser. Here I showed it in the Chrome browser, but you also have similar tools in Firefox or Safari. So we had a look at error messages, that we shouldn't panic when we read them. We had a look at other approaches we can take to find and fix errors, and we had a look at the browser developer tools. Now, let's have a look at a dedicated tool which is available for React development, which can help us with React specific problems and which can help us with understanding our React application better. And that would be the React DevTools. You can simply search for React DevTools and you should find an entry here on chrome.google.com. They are also available for Firefox, but I would strongly recommend that you use Google Chrome if you want to work with them, because they're a browser extension which you can add to the browser. Now, I already did add them, but you can add them here with a simple add button in case you didn't add them to your browser yet. So you simply visit that page here in the Chrome extensions store, though these tools, this extension is totally free. You don't need to pay, no worries. And you simply add it to your browser. You might be prompted to restart your browser thereafter, but once you added them, here in your browser DevTools, you'll have two new tabs, Components and Profiler. Now we'll have a look at the Profiler later in the course. For now, let's focus on Components. If we click on it, we see a little component tree here on the right. And that is what we're building with React, right? We're building a tree of components. So it makes sense that we see that here. And what's interesting here is that here we only see React components. Now in the browser, we got the Elements tab, and there we see the entire DOM as it was rendered by the browser. And in the end, that's just the DOM that is implied by our components. So that can also be useful for debugging our DOM and our UI. But the difference to the Components tab here is that in the Components tab, we see the actual React components and the components structure that is responsible for this UI output. And we see, for example, that we have that root app component, and it's even getting highlighted on the left, with the course input component, which has the button component, with the course goal list component with the different course goal items. We can also click on those components to get more information about them. Here, for example, we already see that a key is set, but then if we scroll down for the course goal item, we actually see a list of all props that it's getting. That includes the children prop, so the content passed between the opening and closing tag, the ID prop, the onTheLead prop, and this new prop, which we can ignore. For the onTheLead prop, we, for example, see that the delete item handler function is passed as a value. For children, we see that it's the text of the task. And if we scroll down further, we see which components were responsible for rendering this. And these components are ordered depending on how close they are. The topmost component here is the component which directly rendered course goal item. And the further down we go here, the further away that component is in the main component tree. Indeed, course goal list component did render the two course goal items, but of course course goal list then was rendered by app, which is why we see that here as well. We also see the source code where we can find information about the course goal item. And if we click on course goal list here, for example, we're taken to that component. Of course, we could have also clicked on it here. You can also search for a component here, like for item, to highlight them and find them quicker. And you can also configure what you see here. The general theme, light mode, dark mode, how it should be displayed, and in general you can play around with the settings here to, for example, display more information, less information, or simply in a different style. I prefer that style and therefore I'll keep it this way. Now what you'll also see is that if you, for example, go to the course input, you don't just see the props there, but you also see the hooks that are being used here. And you see that in there we're using two state hooks. remember that I mentioned that use state, which we use to manage state, is a so-called React hook. And later we'll learn about other hooks as well. So this is a so-called React hook, and that's why it's showing up under this hooks section here. It's a state hook, which is responsible for managing the state of course input. And here we can see and actually also change the current state. For example, here, if I enter master React, you see that's reflected down there. And if I add an exclamation mark here, it's not reflected in the input, because in our code, we're actually not feeding the current value back into the input. We could do that by setting the value prop, but we're not doing that here. But nonetheless, if I now add the goal, you see that the exclamation mark is part of the text that was added here. Here it is. Or here it was, since I clicked on it. So we can change the state here, and it really will have an effect on the UI. On the app component, we, for example, see our array of goals. And if I change one of the goals here, if I change the text here by adding multiple exclamation marks, that is reflected here on the left as well. So that's another great tool for playing around with your interface, with your state, with your props, and for understanding how everything is connected, and also for trying out different use cases and different scenarios. So that's the last tool I want to show you in this module, because the React Dev tools can also be really useful when it comes to debugging and analyzing your React application.